to students. So hopefully I'm well practiced. I'm actually a botanist by trade, but mycology is kind of a passion of mine. So without further ado, I'll just get us on to the next slide here. I thought I should let you know how this webinar is going to work. I've got a presentation. It should take maybe 45 minutes to an hour to go through. If you have any questions at all during the webinar, type them into the chat. And we have Sandy, also from the Saskatchewan Mycological Working Group, who will be monitoring the chat and will be able to answer them all afterwards. So after the presentation, we'll have about a half hour set aside for a Q&A. We'll go through anything that was asked during the presentation, and if anything new comes up, feel free to ask then as well. I'm totally happy for this to be a back and forth or a discussion. I just have in bold here, just note that the presentation's recorded. So if you do choose to use your microphone, your voice will just be in recording. I don't love the sound of my own voice recorded, so if you'd prefer to type in your questions into the chat, that's totally fine too. All right, so here's a little outline of what I plan to talk about. First of all, what is mycology? What are fungi? How does a mushroom grow? And I'd like to get into a little bit of how it goes right from spore to hyphae to mycelium all the way through to a mushroom. I want to talk just a little bit about why mushrooms have a bunch of different shapes and sizes and that kind of thing. We'll talk a little bit about how mushrooms interact with other species, so why we might find them only under certain types of trees, and what are some current up-and-coming areas of study within mycology. There's a lot of really exciting research going on right now, and I just want to share a little bit of that with you. And then, of course, at the end, I'll give you a couple ideas of where you can learn some more if this sparks your interest. So to start off with, I'm assuming you've heard the term since you did sign up to come to a webinar about mycology, but basically it's the study of all things fungi. So it's the branch of biology where we look at fungal taxonomy, how we categorize the mushrooms and the other fungi, why they're named the way they are. And unfortunately, taxonomy is shifting all of the time right now due to more studies into the genetics of fungi. So as we learn more about how they're genetically related, they're getting moved around in groups and renamed. So that can be kind of tricky if you are into studying taxonomy. The ecology, because mushrooms and fungi have all kinds of really cool ecological interactions with other species. They're really important in the food web. Mycologists tend to look at genetics, as I mentioned before, but for more reasons than just taxonomy. It also gives some insight into their biochemical properties and their use by humans. So humans tend to use fungi in really large-scale industrial ways and also small-scale farming. And we may chat a little bit about that later if we've got some time. So mycology is sort of a young field of study. The reason I add in the sort of is that people have been fascinated by mushrooms and fungi and have studied them for a very, very long time. The term mycology, however, didn't come around until like the first quarter of the 19th century. I'm thinking like, I can't remember the exact date, 1820 something is the first time people claim to have seen it in writing. And even during that time, it was considered to be a part of botany, which is the study of plants. So in the late 1960s, scientists realized that fungi is much more closely related to animals than it is to plants. And that's when mycology was finally sort of emancipated. It became its own field of study, and fungi were upgraded to having their own kingdom. So that brings us to our second point. What exactly are fungi? We're talking about studying them, but what are they, right? So I've got a little tree of life here, and you can see circled is fungi right here at the end of the branch, right next to animals. So fungal and animal kingdoms share some features. They've got chitinous structures. So if you haven't heard of chitin before, the really interesting thing is that it is the main component of insect exoskeletons. So you know how bugs are crunchy? They have their skeleton on the outside, and that's made up of chitin. And the neat thing is that fungi also have these cell walls. So this sort of like outer coating on their hyphae and mycelium that's also made out of chitin. So that's pretty cool, and evolutionarily points to them being related to animals. Fungi also store excess food as glycogen. This is a compound that we previously thought was unique to the animal kingdom. So humans can actually store extra food in their livers, just in this sort of chemical form called glycogen. And the last one is posterior flagellum. So obviously not all life stages of animals will have a flagellum. There are some smaller single-celled animal-like things that have flagella on them, but also, for example, most sperm cells will have flagella to help them swim. And not all fungi possess flagella either, but if they do, that flagellum is on the back of the cell to propel the cell forward. So it's a little bit of a technical thing, but it's just another little bit of evidence that fungi and animals are somewhat closely related. So true fungi have a number of characteristics that define them as fungi and not as plants or animals. So this is kind of how they're categorized into their own group. So they are eukaryotic organisms. That means they have nuclei in them, just like basically anything except bacteria and viruses do. More specifically, these guys are heterotrophic. That means they need to eat. So unlike plants, which can photosynthesize and get their chemical energy from the sun and their carbon from the air, fungi actually need to digest organic matter and absorb it in order to obtain nutrition, which means they don't contain any plastids. No chloroplasts for fungi means no photosynthesis for the fungi. The really cool thing about these is that they can be unicellular or multicellular. So some fungi never really get any bigger than a single cell. So think of yeast, like baker's yeast, for example. You always just see it as like teeny tiny little bits of powder and that kind of thing. And then, of course, they can be very large organisms as well. There is a big mass of, I believe it's honey mushroom mycelium that lives underneath a forest floor down in the States, and it's possibly the biggest living organism that we know of. So they can get massive. So fungi have this really cool thing called absorptive nutrition, which means they're osmotrophic. I know, another big word for saying that they absorb their nutrition. Some other animals or animal-like organisms, I guess, that can absorb their nutrition have sort of jelly-like cells that can actually engulf things. Think of like a slime mold going around a piece of oat and then absorb it internally. Because fungi have those hard cell walls made of chitin, they're not able to wrap around things and absorb them. They need to actually secrete their digestive enzymes out into the substrate, break it down there, and then absorb it as a liquid. So it's pretty neat if you've seen videos of time lapses of food molding, for example. Those hyphae are on the outside of the apple or orange or whatever it is, and as those enzymes are secreted out, it's actually breaking down the food. I don't know, it's kind of cool to me. Another big feature of true fungi are that they reproduce by spores. And I'm sure you've seen sort of clouds of spores coming out of puffballs and that kind of thing. So I want to try something out here. I have not done this before in Zoom, but it's a new feature I have access to. I'm going to share a poll and see if people can respond here. All right, is this popping up on people's screens? It should say fungi are everywhere. And you can type in where you have seen fungi or evidence of a fungus today. Oh, awesome. Responses are rolling in. This is perfect. I'm excited to see how it works. I'll let it run down for another, I don't know, 30 seconds? Okay, let's see. Hmm. Wow, is that not gonna work for us? Well, I didn't realize it was going to make me log in just to see. Oh, I'm so sorry, everyone. I'm not able to see the results of our poll. Do you want to just drop it in the chat instead? I'm so sorry to make the extra work for you. It's supposed to be fun audience participation, you know? Oh, I see some good ones here in my basement in my grow tent. So we have a mushroom grower here. Oh, a lot of people in the fridge. So whether it's mushrooms or food mold. Uh, oh, grout in the bathroom. I definitely get the mildew in there. Oh, photos? Yeah, absolutely. Oh, someone says beer here. Absolutely. So fungus or yeast is one of the major fermenters we've got. Oh, wow. Someone found puffballs on their land today, still with spores to explode. It is unseasonably warm right now. I can't believe we're still finding mushrooms out there. Oh, a very ripe pear with mold. Okay, yeah, these are all awesome. Um, I also happened to see some in the greenhouse at work today because we have a couple of fungal pathogens in there. One of our professors is studying powdery mildew. Luckily, I didn't see any in the form of plant or of animal diseases today, but I have had a guinea pig before with ringworm, so that is another place we see fungus. And the other neat thing that I find extremely fascinating is if you saw any cattle today, they have a whole bunch of fungus, rumen fungi, they're called, living in their guts to help them digest their feed. So fungi are absolutely everywhere. And to be honest, I'm probably breathing in fungal spores right now. Okay, let's get this slideshow running again. There we go. I hope that worked. That moves us on to how does a mushroom grow? Um, there are a few really, really cool things that happen. So we mentioned that mushrooms reproduce by spores, right? So what a spore is a teeny, teeny, tiny little structure that has been adapted for survival. So it usually has a hard, sort of chitinous outer layer, and it's very hydrophobic. So anyone who has tried to, say, wash mold out of a Tupperware container will notice that they float right up to the surface, right? Um, and it's packed kind of with nutrients and genetic material in there, so a new fungus can grow from a single spore. Now I've got a little diagram here. Unfortunately, it didn't blow up very nicely, but once a spore has found a suitable area, well, a single hypha or hyphae will germinate from it. And what that is just like a teeny tiny little tube that's sort of prodding out into the environment. Assuming it's on a suitable substrate or area to grow, that hypha will branch. And the really neat thing is that these hyphae have polar growth and they're growing at the tip. So as they keep branching, they'll sort of branch equally in every direction. So if you've ever seen, say, a tiny bit of mold growing on something, especially if you've seen it on petri dishes, it seems to go out in a perfect circle. And it's because these hyphae are just expanding and branching sort of exponentially in equal directions. Of course, it's not always the case if a hypha encounters something that is unpalatable, that it doesn't want to eat, or sometimes different fungi will have chemical warfare almost. So they'll deter other fungi from growing into their area, and you can actually see little exclusion zones where one fungus will be growing, and then stop in one direction because it gets too close to another one. So anyway, once you have all of your hyphae like this, you'll have a great big bunch of them called a mycelium. So just to get a little bit more in depth here. What is a hypha? You'll hear this a lot whenever someone's talking about mycology. It's just kind of the basic vegetative assimilative organ, we call it. So it's a little tube, and the entire body of a fungus is made up of it, with the exception of spores. So within the hyphae, there is cytoplasm, the liquid, and there are little nuclei with the genetic material suspended in it, and they can actually move. So even if there are little cell walls, it's a septate hypha, the cytoplasm can still move back and forth. These hyphae are kind of unbelievably strong for how little they are, and mostly waterproof as well. And that kind of keeps the moisture in. So if you've noticed how fast a mold can overtake something, you'll know that hyphae are growing incredibly quickly for their size. And they're always growing from the tip. So anything kind of behind the tip of the hypha is basically just taken up by these large sort of vesicles, like bubbles of liquid. There's not as much going on. The tip of the hypha is where all the action happens, basically. So that's where it's secreting its digestive enzymes and absorbing nutrition for the rest of the body of the mycelium. So you might notice that, I guess, I keep thinking of Petri dishes because I use them a lot at work, but I guess the hyphae are kind of like eating as they go. So they're always exploring their environment to find new nutrition because they use it up as they move through it. So if it gets to the edge of its area where there's nutrition, be that its Petri dish or the edge of its bread, if it's bread mold, it realizes, I guess, not to give it sentience, but that it's out of nutrition, and that's often when you'll start to see reproductive structures occurring. And I've just got a photo here of a really neat little mycelium I found this past summer on a chunk of wood. So that is the main body of the fungus. So a whole bunch of hyphae, and you can see they're kind of interwoven on there. So we call it also a thallus, you'll hear sometimes, so the body of the fungus. And proteins can be synthesized throughout that whole mycelium. So the nutrition is being taken in through the tips and sort of distributed throughout the whole body of the mycelium. And it's making proteins and growing. So this is actually sort of the major part of a fungus. We always think of just the mushroom, right, when we're out in the forest, but there's a huge network of this stuff under the ground. Oh, I suppose I should say, once it's ready, say we're talking about not a mold, but like a bigger forest mushroom. When it's ready to produce a fruiting body, these mycelium will actually just weave together a whole bunch of hyphae into a very, very specialized structure, which is the mushroom. So all of these mushrooms you see here are just really tightly woven bundles of hyphae with special properties. And there are tons and tons of different shapes of mushrooms. And in case you're wondering why, it's all about reproduction, right? Let me see. Oh, here we go. I got a laser pointer now on here. So in the top, we've got these puffball mushrooms. And they are specialized to produce a bunch of spores inside this top area, and then they will get an opening on the top. So as they're disturbed by animals or raindrops, the spores can actually puff out and they're dispersed by wind. We have our regular sort of gilled mushrooms here, our amanita. So as they emerge, you'll notice they have a long stalk, and that is to raise the cap up as high as possible to catch wind currents. So when it's mature, the cap opens up, it's got all those gills on the underneath, and as the spores drop off, they hit the wind and are moved to new areas to start new colonies of fungus. What are some other really interesting ones? This one here is very cool. It's called strawberries and cream, or the bleeding tooth fungus. It's kind of an interesting one because it forms teeth instead of gills, and the spores are born on the teeth. Again, the spores can drop from underneath and be carried off by the wind or by other little insects and organisms. We've got polypores that grow on trees. These ones have a nice sort of advantage to catching the wind because many of them will grow on standing dead trees and they'll get tons and tons of height, right? So as the spores are dropping out of the tiny holes in the bottom of the mushroom, they can be swept meters and meters away by the wind. In this photo I picked, I didn't manage to get a stinkhorn. My apologies, but if you've seen the mushrooms, some of them have a really cool veil structure on them, but they have like a sticky brown substance on the top. Those ones actually don't have a wind dispersal, but rather are dispersed by insects. So the reason they smell so absolutely terrible is because the gleba, or that gross stuff on the top of the mushroom, is actually chock full of spores. And insects will come investigate the scent, get spores stuck to them, and then fly them far away, hopefully to find a new substrate to live in. So that's just a small sampling. There are many, many more shapes and sizes of mushrooms, and I could probably talk about that just for an hour, so I will spare you the details for now. So our fifth question here, why do we find some mushrooms only under certain types of trees? I'm sure many of you have guessed it, and that is because of mycorrhizal associations. There's a lot of research being done on this right now and how we can actually kind of harness these associations for improving forestry and agriculture and that kind of thing. But it's estimated that up to, I think, 80% plus of land plants will actually be able to form an association with the fungus. So a lot of forest mushrooms, if they're found, say, only under spruce trees, or some of them are only found under hardwoods, it's because they've likely co-evolved together, the tree species and the fungus. And as you can see from this image, which again showed up a little bit blurry on my screen here, there's a lot of mycelium and hyphae here, and then there's a tiny little seedling with its roots, and then you can see these structures where they interface together. So the fungal hyphae of these mycorrhizal fungi are actually able to sort of coat the outside of the root of these plants in what is called a mantle. And they're able to sort of chemically interfere with the way the roots of the plant grow. So you'll see that there's short, stubby little roots off the side here. It keeps those roots young and they don't get woody growth. So it's easier for the fungus to pass nutrients back and forth. It's a really amazing partnership because any extra photosynthates, which are sugars produced by the plant, can be taken up by the fungus, and as a nutrition and carbon source. And then the fungus can actually essentially increase the surface area of the roots of the tree. So although it keeps these stubby little roots, all of these mycelia are actively taking up water and especially phosphorus in a lot of cases, which is a little bit harder for plants to access and can pass the water and phosphorus back to the tree. Scientists are finding there are a lot of benefits that hadn't previously been thought about in terms of these mycorrhizal associations. One of the cool ones I read about recently is that a beneficial relationship like this takes up space on the roots of the plant, right? So all of the places that the mycelium is occupying on the root is one less place that a pathogenic fungus or bacteria won't be able to penetrate the plant root. So it technically decreases susceptibility to disease and can also make the plants more, I guess, tolerant to things like drought because of this larger surface area that is actively uptaking water. So there's a lot of really neat stuff going on. Which brings me kind of back around to if you're interested in foraging and mushroom hunting, you always hear that you have to look in a specific habitat with a specific type of trees. Like in Saskatchewan, for example, I'd say chanterelles are almost always under jack pine here, and that is because they have a mycorrhizal association with that species of tree. All right, and I talked a little bit there about the studies, but that kind of brings us to some current up and coming areas of study within mycology. My students recently did a bunch of presentations on different, I guess, different areas of research within mycology, and some of them I was even unaware of because they're fairly new papers and that kind of thing. But we have some traditional areas of study in mycology, starting with, honestly, traditional biotechnology. So our fermentation and that kind of thing, it's now been scaled up incredibly to industrial scale fermentation. If you've ever taken lactase, say for like lactose intolerance, if sometimes I just want to eat an ice cream. Because fungi produce so many digestive enzymes that they actively secrete, they're a really sort of powerful tool in biotechnology to produce large quantities of enzymes that humans can use for things. Additionally, there's been a lot of work done recently on the different things that fungi can degrade or break down, including plastics and styrofoam and that kind of thing. There have been some species of fungus in the past that have been able to survive on, correct me if I'm wrong here, I want to say polyurethane potentially as their sole carbon source. So there is a possibility, probably a ways away, of using them to help break down the excessive amount of plastic waste we have. Fungi are being used in mycoremediation. So if you've heard of bioremediation, right, which is, or bioreclamation, like reclaiming contaminated areas, if you throw fungi into the mix, it can potentially help the situation. I know there have been studies done using fungi as in kind of like straw matting in old logging areas. And the idea is that they're gonna help with, why can't I think of the word right now? Soil erosion. So often straw matting is used when soil erosion is an issue in, I guess, development areas and that kind of thing. Adding in or inoculating that straw with mycelium can add an extra layer of water filtration and can actually bind the straw together even better. Ooh, what else do we have here? Does anyone want to throw in the chat things that they've heard about recently? Oh, okay, now how do I get rid of my laser pointer so I can actually use my mouse again? There we go. Oh, coffins, absolutely. I have seen some pretty nifty videos on a coffin that is built using mycelium as the construction material. And the idea is that it's a very green burial, right? And that the fungus can actually help break down the body afterward as well. Oh, yeah, mycelium leather. There are a few different companies that are using mycelium to make a leather alternative, which is pretty fantastic. It almost kind of like looks and feels like leather from what I've heard, but is made out of mushrooms. Oh, psilocybin to treat anxiety and depression. Absolutely. This is a pretty big up and coming area of research from what I've read. And we actually have one lab on campus that is looking into the sort of biochemical reactions, I guess, within humans with psilocybin type compounds. But yeah, there's been a lot recently about using magic mushrooms in controlled environments as a treatment for anxiety, depression, PTSD, that kind of thing. So yeah, mycelium is building blocks is a big one. Pharmaceuticals is a big one, right? I've also been hearing about lion's mane in relation to neural health. So for Alzheimer's, maybe for ADHD, things where you want to build new connections in the brain. So there's research being done on that. I'm not sure what the conclusions are right now. Yeah, so anyway, there is a lot going on in mycology. And every time I read something, I realize that the more we learn, the less we realize we know about fungi. They're incredibly complex, diverse, amazing life forms that have such a wide variety of use for humans and kind of ecosystem benefits in general. They're one of the only degraders of lignin. So without fungi, we would have a massive, massive buildup of wood in forests and probably a lot more forest fires. Let's see here. Next slide. Okay, that brings me to my last point before I completely talk your ear off about how exciting mushrooms are. These are some great places to learn more. So the Sask Mycology and Saskatchewan Mushroom Picking Facebook pages. I'm sure a lot of you probably heard about the webinar on one or the other or both of these, but there's a lot of people who are just really, really enthusiastic about fungi in the province and are happy to chat about what they know on there. My all-time favorite textbook was written by Bryce Kendrick. He's kind of a prominent Canadian mycologist. And I do believe that University of Victoria offers a distance education course, sort of a continuing education course that includes lectures from Bryce Kendrick. The 21st Century Guidebook to Fungi is sort of like an open source online textbook, and it is pretty pretty comprehensive with a lot of things. So if you want to read a little bit more in depth, that's a good place to go. Local experts, obviously. In Saskatchewan, we have Donovan Thiessen, who makes a lot of videos under the name is it Mushroom Wizard, I believe? It kind of runs through different species in Saskatchewan, how to identify them. Those are fantastic. And oh yes, I see the Alberta Mycological Society is good and active on TikTok. Oh, I didn't realize they had a TikTok page, but the Alberta Mycological Society is kind of where I got my start with mycology. I went to the Great Alberta Mushroom Foray. So they have quite a lot of experts out in Alberta. And oh, iNaturalist as well, I see on here. iNaturalist is fantastic because you can upload your photos there, and other people are able to sort of chime in on what kind of mushroom they think you've got. So I think that's all I'm gonna do for now. But if you have any questions at all, I am more than happy to answer them if I can. So feel free you can chime in the chat, or you are welcome to unmute your microphone, whatever you like. Or if anyone just wants to share things, that's okay too.